The whole of London's talking about you.
There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about.
Suffering is one very long moment. We cannot divide it by seasons. We can only record its moods and chronicle their return. With us, time itself does not progress. It revolves. It seems to circle round one centre of pain, the paralysing immobility of a life, every circumstance of which is regulated after an unchangeable pattern, so that we eat and drink and lie down and pray, or kneel at least for prayer, according to the inflexible laws of an iron formula. This immobile quality, that makes each dreadful day in the very minutest detail like its brother, seems to communicate itself to those external forces, the very essence of whose existence is ceaseless change, of seed time or harvest, of the reapers bending over the corn or the grape-gatherers threading through the vines, of the grass in the orchard made white with broken blossoms or strewn with fallen fruit. Of these we know nothing, and can know nothing. I'm going to tell you a story about a man named Oscar. Now, you've probably heard of Oscar. He was a writer who lived quite a long time ago. He wrote plays, poems, short stories, a novel. He was quite good at what he did, and people were enamoured of him. He was famous and popular. He had a wife and 2 children who loved him dearly. His life was going brilliantly for quite a long time. But Oscar liked men. Now, obviously, liking men is a perfectly natural thing to do. Lots of gentlemen do it. But when Oscar was alive, such a thing was not allowed. Be gay, do crimes was meant quite literally in those days. But as long as you were careful and kept it quiet, then it wasn't really too much of an issue. A lot of people were gay in the 1890s. Where Oscar's problems really began was when he met a boy called Bosie. Bosie was the most beautiful person that Oscar had ever seen, and he fell in love with him. The two went everywhere together, completely inseparable. Oscar even met Bosie's mother and wrote her into one of his plays. For a while, everything seemed to be going perfectly. But here's the thing. Bosie was just the worst. He was spoiled and arrogant, and he relied on his father for money. Now, his father was not a very nice man, and when he found out about Oscar and Bosie, he got very angry and left a card at Oscar's club calling him a sodomite. I feel that his inability to spell sodomite is a very important detail to this story. Bosie, being the piss boy that he was, convinced Oscar to sue his father for libel. This was a very bad decision. The defence would bring out a lot of the men that Oscar had spent money to spend time with. Bosie's father was found innocent, but with the new evidence brought out against Oscar, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Oscar at this point could have fled the country, gone to France, waited for this whole thing to blow over. But he stayed to fight the charges of sodomy and gross indecency. We don't know why he did it. Maybe it was arrogance, or naivete, or maybe he was just tired of hiding. But things would end badly for him. He was put on trial, with excerpts of his novel being used as evidence against him. He would be found guilty of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years and 3 months hard labour in prison. This would be very difficult on Oscar, who was not the healthiest man. He suffered a lot in those 2 years and sought solace from his beloved Bosie, writing him letters. But Bosie, continuing to be a detestable scrotum of a man, would tell Oscar that while he was sick, he was no longer interesting. So Oscar suffered alone. Once he was released, he couldn't just return home. The people no longer loved him. He was an outcast, and so he fled, surviving only on money given to him by his estranged wife Constance. And here he could have maybe been happy. Not as happy as he once was, but happy enough to live a life. But he just couldn't help himself. He had to see Bosie again. The man had ruined his life, but he still loved him. The two spent more time together, even though Constance had explicitly said that if he were to see Bosie again, she would cut him off financially. So the two were reliant on Bosie's mother for money, but she also cut them off. And Bosie unceremoniously left. A few years later, living in poverty, Oscar would get meningitis and die. a poet, a playwright, a man who fell in love with the wrong boy and let his own poor decisions lead to his downfall. Oscar Wilde is an inspirational and tragic figure to so many. He was punished for who he was and who he loved. His relationship with Alfred Bosie Douglas is one of the great tragic romances of all time. And what that leads me into talking about today... hold on, sorry, something about that just didn't scan right. Let me just... let's see... inspirational and tragic, yeah. Punished for who he... yeah, that makes sense. Tragic romance... that's the problem. When I said tragic romance, what I should have said is abusive relationship. So, why did I initially think of it in those romantic terms? Well...
there is only one thing worse than playing squash together, and that is playing it by yourself. I wish I hadn't said that.
I amused myself with being a flaneur, a dandy, a man of fashion. I surrounded myself with the smaller natures and the meaner minds. I became a spendthrift of my own genius, and to waste an eternal youth gave me a curious joy. Tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths in the search for new sensation. What the paradox was to me in the sphere of thought, perversity became to me in the sphere of passion. Desire at the end was a malady, or a madness, or both. I grew careless of the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on. I forgot that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character, and that therefore what one has done in the secret chamber, one has some day to cry aloud on the housetop. I ceased to be lord over myself. I was no longer the captain of my soul and did not know it. I allowed pleasure to dominate me. I ended in horrible disgrace. There is only one thing for me now. Absolute humility. Part 1. Looking Up at the Stars. Wilde is a 1997 film directed by Brian Gilbert, starring Stephen Fry as Oscar Wilde, in one of the greatest pieces of casting of all time, with baby Jude Law as Bosie Douglas and similarly baby Michael Sheen as Oscar's friend and first male lover Robbie Ross. The film details Wilde's life from before his fame took off, right the way through to just after his imprisonment, when he reunited with Bosie, looking at the ups and downs of their relationship and the effect that Oscar's decisions had on his family. It's a story of a gentle, queer man in a time that was willing to use him for his mind and his words, but not willing to accept him for who he was. As the film begins, his life is going along nicely. He's just been on a trip to America at a very homoerotic mine. His wife, Constance, played by Jennifer Ely, has just told him that she's pregnant.
A new Wilde for the world. Another genius for Ireland.
And they've just made a good new friend in Robbie Ross, who, in private, comes on to Oscar, showing us Michael Sheen's lovely bottom. Oscar truly discovers himself in this moment, and begins to explore his own sexuality. Now, if there's one thing Oscar Wilde wasn't, it was abstemious. He wasn't ever going to be happy with just one young man for company, and he's soon finding other partners, such as the dashingly handsome poet John Gray, who may very well have been the inspiration for Wilde's horror novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. He fairly callously discards Robbie for John, and then similarly drops John when he gets together with Bosie, giving us a glimpse of Jude Law's happy little bum. From here, the film goes through various stages of an abusive relationship. Oscar is completely enamoured of Bosie's beauty, and Bosie finds Oscar fascinating for his talent and his wit. But the two are not equal in the relationship. Oscar is made to feel insecure at all points because Bosie puts him down and acts distant. When Oscar tries to do the sex on him, Bosie turns him down and takes them out to a brothel where he makes a big show out of being intimate with one of the boys there, making sure that Oscar sees it. When Oscar is sick, or when he actually has to do his work, then Bosie calls him boring and they get into blazing rows which drive them apart.
You don't interest me, not when you're ill. You're just a boring middle-aged man with a blocked-up nose.
Bosie, dearest boy.
Shut up!
Until they inevitably get back together again. Oscar knows that he's being treated badly, but keeps going back to him. It's pointed out to him by eternal voice of reason, Robbie, but he ignores his friend's advice and returns over and over again. There's one point where Oscar has decided that he has had enough and won't go back to Bosie ever again, but then he learns that Bosie's brother has killed himself, and he immediately rushes back to comfort him, something that Bosie undoubtedly wouldn't do for him. That imbalance in affection is seen throughout their whole relationship. Oscar is doting and caring, giving Bosie lavish gifts and genuinely trying to be with him, while Bosie is loudly and actively distant, clearly just enjoying the attention that being seen with Oscar Wilde brings him. There were real moments of connection between the two, but they get so lost and buried under all of Bosie's bluster and Oscar's apparent naivete that it always feels like they're just completely wrong for each other, but neither one can realise it. After Bosie's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, played by Tom Wilkinson, starts making trouble, it is on Bosie's prompting that Oscar pursues the matter legally. We see the famous moment where Oscar describes the love that dare not speak its name.
It is in this century misunderstood. So much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name.
Before seeing his imprisonment, with only Robbie showing him any kindness. While he's in prison, Bosie never visits him. Oscar uses his time to write De Profundis, the most extravagant Dear John letter in all of history. He knows that they should no longer be together, and that it should be over forever. But once he's out, well, Oscar could resist everything except temptation. Against all best judgment, he reunites with Bosie one last time. And that is where that chapter of Oscar Wilde's life ended. But there was another chapter waiting to be told.
Your Majesty is like a big jam donut with cream on the top.
Beg your pardon?
It was one of Whistler.
Then I must learn how to be happy. Once I knew it, or thought I knew it by instinct. It was always springtime once in my heart. My temperament was akin to joy. I filled my life to the very brim with pleasure, as one might fill a cup to the very brim with wine. Now, I am approaching life from a completely new standpoint, and even to conceive happiness is often extremely difficult for me. Part 2. In the Gutter. The Happy Prince is a 2018 film written and directed by Rupert Everett. It follows Oscar Wilde's life after his time in prison. We see his initial difficulties in living in exile under an assumed name, his reunion with Bosie and the depravity that the two get up to in their few months together, followed by his return to Paris and his fatal illness. The film begins near the end, with Oscar, played by Everett, living in squalor, filching money wherever he can get it to spend on a young prostitute and drugs. After performing a song in a bar,
The boy I love is out in the gallery. The boy I love is looking down at me.
he falls, reopening the wound that he received in prison and leaving him susceptible to the infection that will kill him. From here, we flash back to his arrival in Paris, where he is adamant that he never intends to see Bosie again, tearing up a letter from him. But very shortly after, he's pieced it back together to read it. He's still weak in that regard. But he doesn't give in to seeing him right away. He wants to live a new life, free from what happened to him. It looks like it might be going well, until he receives some homophobic abuse from a group of strangers who recognise him.
Remind me to change the sheets today, darling boy. Your slim gilt cheeks have left a shit stain all the way down your side of the bed.
They pursue him and his friends Reggie Turner, played by Colin Firth, and Robbie Ross, played by Edwin Thomas, until Oscar snaps and confronts them. This takes Oscar right back to one of the worst moments of his imprisonment, when he was being transferred to the Reading jail and a crowd formed to mock him.
We don't want any of that love that don't speak its Monica here.
The combination of reliving this old trauma and this latest trauma is enough to make him cave in and reunite with Bosie, played by Colin Morgan.
The boy I love is up in the gallery.
He knows that it won't end well. He knows what Bosie did to him, but he goes anyway. Because, as he views it,
Suffering is nothing when there is love.
he's fully aware that he's going to suffer again. But he's willing to face it for his misplaced love in Bosie. When he meets Bosie at the train station, there's a moment where everything that's happened to him as a result of being with this man hits him, and he just breaks down into tears. And the only person who is there to comfort him is the same man. It's a heartbreaking microcosm of someone who has lost his whole support system and just dives back into the very thing that made him miserable. The way he and Bosie interact with one another is quite different here. There's a lot more bitterness on Oscar's part. The two are still clearly enamoured with each other, but there's an underlying hostility to it. Oscar makes a very pointed barb at one point.
Robbie loves me, Bosie, in a way that you could never understand.
A tactic we have already seen him use on Robbie.
Bosie loves me, Robbie, in a way that you could never understand.
And once the two have run off to Naples together, they're clearly both doing their best to make the other jealous. The toxicity of their interactions is far more on the surface this time. Oscar has been cut off by his wife Constance, played by Emily Watson, so Bosie is their sole source of money. Oscar is reliant on him financially and emotionally, but he has to try and keep Bosie from his outbursts and keep the locals from killing him. They live in debauchery with a lot of handsome young men, allowing us to see a few nice perky posteriors. But it falls apart when Bosie also gets cut off, and the two part ways after one last blowout argument. After this, Oscar has nothing, and he falls back into the state that we see him at the start of the movie, in French poverty, which is like regular poverty, only more decadent. He sees Bosie once more, trying to get money off him. Bosie turns him down, saying this nonsense.
Some of us have to work.
Bosie Douglas never worked a day in his damn life, and if you don't hate him, then you just haven't been paying attention. With no more chance for money or reconciliation with Bosie, he dives even deeper into his desperation, drinking, drugs and whoring, until he succumbs to illness, and finally loses his mortal combat with the wallpaper. So, now that we have an understanding of these two films, let's see how they differ.
Your Highness, you're also like a stream of bat spits.
What?
It was one of Wilde.
It's sodding was not!
I don't regret for a single moment having lived for pleasure. I did it to the full, as one should do everything that one does. There was no pleasure I did not experience. I threw the pearl of my soul into a cup of wine. I went down the primrose path to the sound of flutes. I lived on honeycomb. But to have continued the same life would have been wrong, because it would have been limiting. I had to pass on. The other half of the garden had its secrets for me also. Part 3. Rarely pure and never simple. These two films make an interesting companion piece to one another. They combine to effectively tell the whole story of Oscar Wilde's adult life and the entirety of his relationship with Bosie Douglas. But the way that they handle their subject matter is decidedly different. Wilde is a lot more optimistic throughout, while The Happy Prince tends to be a lot more dour. And that's understandable given the different periods they're portraying. I mean, Oscar Wilde's life had a lot more ups before prison. Probably the best way to compare the tone of the two is to look at a couple of scenes that they have in common. The first is an infamous speech that Oscar made on the opening night of Lady Windermere's Fan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have enjoyed this evening immensely.
The actors have given a charming rendering of a delightful play.
The words are identical, given that they're what he actually said in real life, but the context they're presented in is very different. In Wilde, we're seeing Oscar on his rise. This is a triumphant moment of his wit and brilliance. We're just meant to enjoy it and laugh along with the audience. Stephen Fry's performance of it is restrained and in control.
And your appreciation has been most intelligent. I congratulate you on the great success of your performance.
You feel it as one of his high points. In The Happy Prince, on the other hand, we see it as a contrast to how low Oscar has fallen. In fact, it literally cuts from him falling to the floor to him rising on that stage. Rupert Everett's performance of these lines is a lot more theatrical and feels really arrogant. The emphasis is on,
Which persuades me that you think almost as highly of the play as I do myself.
so the difference between how the two want us to view Oscar Wilde is clear. Wilde wants us to like him and enjoy being around him. The Happy Prince wants us to question him and reveal that he wasn't perfect. And that, ultimately, is the difference in the framing. Wilde is the story of a victim of a hateful society who naively falls into a relationship that destroys his life, whereas The Happy Prince is the story of a man who destroyed his own life and willingly goes back to one of the causes of that destruction, even though he knows it will continue to hurt him. We see these differences in how they show Oscar relating to Bosie. In Wilde, he's doting and caring, he lavishes gifts on Bosie and spends so much of his time admiring him. He is the loving partner who is having his head messed with by this arrogant little prick. We're never really meant to doubt that he's good and innocent, and if it weren't for the backwards time he lived in, he'd have been able to live his life more happily. In The Happy Prince, though, he gives back a lot of the cruelty he receives. Stephen Fry's Oscar Wilde would never be as manipulative as Rupert Everett is seen to be.
Bosie loves me, Ruby. Ruby loves me, Bosie.
It's a toxic relationship on both sides instead of just the one. The other moment that the two share is the reunion of Oscar and Bosie following Oscar's imprisonment. There are still similarities in why Oscar goes back to Bosie in both films. In Wilde, it follows finding out about the death of Constance, a year before her real-life death, with a sense that there's nothing left to keep him from going to his true love. In The Happy Prince, it's the homophobic abuse we've already discussed, with the reunion turned into this moment where Oscar decides he doesn't have anything else to lose, so he might as well go back to Bosie. And everything that's happened comes crashing down on him as he seals his own lonely end. This is the beginning of new troubles. But in Wilde, this is the end of the film, so it comes across as a happy ending, which I take issue. Sure, there's some text afterwards saying that they separated 3 months later, but that's not what you'll take home with you when you see it. The end of the film makes it look like they're meant to be happy together, even though this relationship has been toxic the whole way through. Just a healthy dose of yikes right there. So the question arises, which of these depictions of their relationship is the right one? Do we need a story that shows Oscar Wilde as an innocent victim of Bosie Douglas's abuse, or do we need a story that shows Oscar Wilde as an arrogant and selfish man who actively hurt the people around him and made decisions that led to his own downfall? Well, I think that the answer is both. We don't need to pick one or the other. Oscar Wilde was an innocent victim, but he was also a selfish, predatory drunk. The aspects of his life that the different films focus on is the decisions of separate filmmakers, 21 years apart. There's value in showing the story of a queer person at that time when they would have been a victim, but there's also value in showing the story of a person leading themselves onto a self-destructive cycle. Neither one is the wrong one.
Your Majesty is like a dose of clap.
Before you arrive is pleasure, and after is a pain in the dog.
What?
One is short.
One is short. You bastard.
All trials are trials for one's life, just as all sentences are sentences of death, and 3 times have I been tried. The first time, I left the box to be arrested. The second time, to be led back to the house of detention. The third time, to pass into a prison for 2 years. Society, as we have constituted it, will have no place for me, has none to offer, but nature, whose sweet rains fall on unjust and just alike, will have clefts in the rock where I may hide, and secret valleys in whose silence I may weep undisturbed. She will hang the night with stars so that I may walk abroad in the darkness without stumbling, and send the wind over my footprints so that none may track me to my hurt. She will cleanse me in great waters, and with bitter herbs make me whole. Part 4. From the Depths. Wilde and The Happy Prince are 2 interestingly unique films about the same man and the same relationship. They present themselves in different ways for different reasons, and they both deliver their messages equally effectively. I would honestly recommend watching both films if you want to learn a bit about what happened to Oscar Wilde and what he did to himself. Oscar Wilde was undoubtedly a flawed man. He hurt the people who were close to him, he let his arrogance define a lot of his life, and his taste in men skewed so young that he would probably make a pretty good finance minister. Topical British politics joke that will immediately date this episode! But he didn't deserve what happened to him. His 2 years in prison significantly weakened his health and led to him dying at the age of only 47. And all because he was gay? It's easy to look back on now as a huge miscarriage of justice, and he is far from alone in that. In 2017, he was posthumously pardoned of his criminal conviction, along with 50,000 other gay men who were wrongfully convicted of their sexuality. It's good that the British government was willing to look at this and see that they had done something wrong, but pardoned as a word suggests that there was a crime committed for them to be pardoned of, which there wasn't. They were just gay. The law was wrong. There's no way to know what art Oscar Wilde would have made if he hadn't gone to prison. He was cut short in his prime, and it's sad to think about what might have been. But still, we can look on the person that he was. Beautiful mind, brilliant wit, poet, playwright and queer icon, and love this man, warts and all. Not Bosie Douglas though, he was a right cunt.
The boy I love is up in the gallery. The boy I love is looking now at me.
Thank you so much for watching. I can think of no better first video of mine for the year than to talk about a toxic relationship on Valentine's Day. Isn't this the best way to start a new year? A new decade? A new plug for my Patreon? For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to my video plus exclusive content. For $5 or more a month, there are other perks that you can get. I kind of messed up the line on this, but I don't want to do another take. Click up here to subscribe, and click over here to watch some more videos by me. That's gonna be it for this one. I'm bad at these outros.